Hey!
That's great. These are your people.
I always get that reaction in Texas.
That's good. Well, welcome. This is I'm very excited and honored, really, to be able to have this conversation with Senator Schiff. He's been such a major figure. We were just talking about. He makes a lot of news, of course, with my background and my current occupation in independent news. That's good, and he tells it like he sees it. And so I'm very appreciative of that as a reporter. A lot of politicians don't. So let me, I'd like to start with a big question about you and about the country, if I could. So for a decade now, you have been one of the leading voices that name and call out and challenge what you see as the wrongs and the dangers of Donald Trump as President of the United States. And has brought you to leadership positions, made you famous around the country, and made you a target of the Justice Department. And I guess two things. Is that the kind of choice, one way or another, that almost all of us have to make? And is it worth it? Because it's scary to have the Department of Justice looking down at you like that.
We do have to make a choice, and it's interesting for me. Prior to Trump becoming president, I think if you asked people in the Congress or outside the Congress what kind of a legislator I was or what kind of a reputation I had, it was as a fairly non-controversial, more or less expert on national security, foreign policy, not a particularly partisan person. And then we had the arrival on the scene of a deeply corrupt, anti-democratic figure who put the country at great risk. And I never felt I had any particular choice about it. I didn't feel it was a particularly partisan thing. But I needed to stand up to this president. I needed to defend our institutions. I think we all do. I think that we live in a state, or should live in a state, of astonishment at how quickly our democratic laws, norms, institutions can be torn down. I never would have imagined anything of the kind. And so I think we're at a particularly vulnerable moment in our history where we do have to take a stand. All of us have lived in a world that was ever increasing in its freedoms. All of us in the post-World War II generation, we came to think it was inevitable, new democracies being born and walls coming down, our freedoms ever expanding. And then we found ourselves at a moment where all of that suddenly was in doubt. We were seeing new autocracies being born. We were seeing new walls going up. We were seeing freedoms taken away. And we have, I think, the same obligation that our parents' generation did who went off to war to defend our democracy. And thank God we don't have to go off to war to do it. But I feel the same sense of mission about it. I've long since reconciled myself to taking whatever comes with it, whether it's from the president, the Congress, the Justice Department. It doesn't matter. I'm not going to be deterred. There's too much at stake, and too many people have sacrificed far more and are sacrificing far more in this stand. And so I will do what I need to do and refuse to be silenced or intimidated by that most unscrupulous, most corrupt of presidents in our history.
Okay, let's talk about the news then. Thank you for that. I do think there's a price to be paid, and you're paying it, and I think that applause and probably what you hear from people around the country, that's respect for your choice.
Well, can I just say, because, I mean, there are folks that are experiencing things far more dangerous, difficult, I talked with families in California who've had their parents ripped away from them by people in masks and deported away from them. I've seen the heartbreak that others are facing. And it's all part of the same struggle. The attack on universities, the effort to intimidate and silence in universities, the attack on media, the extortion of ABC, then CBS, the attack on law firms, a president trying to tell law firms who they can represent and who they can't, an administration that tries to tell companies who they can hire and who they can't. This is all part of the same struggle. And I think we need to view it in its comprehensive whole. There's a role for all of us in this. I think what we saw a couple weeks ago when people went to the polls is the last best hope for our democracy. It's not going to come from Republicans in Congress who continue to be supine enablers of the president. It's not going to come from the Supreme Court of the United States, which has become among the worst enablers of the president. It's going to have to come from the most important participants in our democracy, and that is the citizens.
Well, that was where I was going, the elections. So when I saw the results across the country, not just in the big races, and you could see the shift towards Democrats, and in different places for different candidates of varying degrees of liberalism or centrism or whatever, I thought to myself, America is still America-ing. That for all of the effort to create a narrative, an atmosphere of inevitability about the triumph of Trumpist populism, people are still going to make pragmatic choices about what they want because they need solutions to problems. How do you feel about the election?
Oh, I was thrilled. I remember saying it was a very, very good night for Democrats, and it has been way too long since I've been able to say that. No, I was thrilled, and the day after the election and the day after that, as I talked to my Senate colleagues, I realized how far beyond that election went than simply the marquee races in New Jersey and in Virginia, or the astonishing results in California with Prop 50, where there were people lined up around the block to vote on a reapportionment measure. Really? That was... I got to tell you, those of you not from California, that was not at all inevitable. Our commission is popular. The idea of eliminating the gerrymander is popular. That was not at all inevitable, but it was, I think, of all the races, probably the most direct referendum on the president himself, since it wasn't involving a choice between candidates. But beyond that, as I talked to my Senate colleagues, they would tell me about cities in their states that had never had a Democratic mayor, that suddenly had a Democratic mayor, and I realized this was top to bottom. This was just a sweeping result. And certainly some of it, a lot of it was the strength of many of our candidates, but a lot of it was also an utter repudiation of the president and his party. At the same time, we can't take this for granted. We cannot expect simply because we had a great night 2 weeks ago that we'll have a great night next year. We have to work to make it happen. I am confident of one thing: the president is going to continue to govern in a ruinous way. He will do his part to have Democrats win the next election, but Democrats need to do their part. We need to have a powerful, positive, bold agenda that we are advancing. It cannot be incremental. One thing I think both the election of Donald Trump, again, and the election of Mamdani had in common is both were vehement agents of change. And one of the reasons I think that we lost the presidential is that the Biden administration and the vice president came to be seen as agents of the status quo. And at a time when millions of people are deeply unsatisfied with the status quo, there's nothing, I think, more perilous to a party than that perception. So we cannot be seen as defending institutions for the sake of restoring a status quo that people thought was deeply unacceptable, but defending our democracy and advancing a bold agenda that makes life better for Americans, more affordable, that makes it possible for people to enjoy the life that many see their parents had. The problem today, unlike during the Great Recession, or the Great Depression is not that people are out of work. The problem today is that people are working, and they can still barely get by. My father was in the schmatta business. If you don't speak Yiddish, you should learn. It's the clothing business, the rag business. When I was a kid, he made $18,000 a year. My parents bought our first home for $18,000. You could buy a home for the annual income of a clothing salesman. And that tells us how things have changed, and it is that change and that difficulty now people face that drives them to embrace any demagogue promising they alone can fix it.
Or embrace a 34-year-old Zoran Mandami, who is a declared democratic socialist, who has that dynamism and energy and brightness of youth. And maybe there's a lot of people saying, try something. The old line in Alice in Wonderland, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. Just start going. And I wonder, it raises the question about what is the Democratic Party's message going to be? Is Mamdani part of that? Or is it going to be more centrists try to win in Virginia as Abigail Spanberger did, or in New Jersey by running basically to the middle? That's the big dispute. I mean, what are the Democrats standing for?
Well, first of all, I think Mamdani was benefited by being young and handsome, and I'm working on that. And you know, having a great facility with how people get their information with social media. I mean, he's really a genius on social media. But I think even more importantly than that, you could have all those qualities. There are lots of young, handsome people who are good on social media who cannot come out of nowhere to win a mayor's race in New York. He also had a very clear agenda that he stuck to with ruthless discipline, and it was one focused on meeting New Yorkers where they lived, literally. And where they lived was in a city they loved, which they couldn't afford to live in. And his just laser focus on those issues, what it takes to pay your rent and get to work and buy food, is what I think really resonated. You can disagree with his policy prescriptions, but you can't really quarrel with the fact he identified and stayed focused on what people cared about. And that's what we all have to do, and it's not going to look the same in every city. You know, he wouldn't win a governor's race in Virginia or New Jersey. Abigail Spanberger probably wouldn't win the mayor's office in New York. So it's not going to look the same, and you know, maybe the lesson for Democrats is stop trying to decide what one figure represents the party and start embracing a broader diversity of people within the party, including diversity of viewpoints within the party.
What unites them? What makes them all Democrats?
Well, I think, and this is the reason I became a Democrat, a common desire to fight for people and give them a chance to succeed, give them a chance at the American dream. The wealthy, the powerful have plenty of advocates. They can take care of themselves. But this is a country in which everything used to be possible for people willing to work hard enough. My father used to like to say, my father passed away last year, he was 96. He used to like to say, from the shtetl to the Congress in 3 generations. And fighting so that everyone has that opportunity, wherever they come from, whatever they look like, that they have the opportunity to succeed, that they have the tools, the access to public education and public health to succeed. That's what made me a Democrat. I think that's what being a Democrat is all about. And if you look at the absolute antithesis of that, it is a president trying to take away food from hungry people, willing to appeal to the Supreme Court of the United States for the right to take food away from hungry people, who only cares about his own wealth and the wealth of other of his cronies. There couldn't be a sharper contrast. And so this is, to me, what unites the Democratic Party.
And you're talking about the working class, but the Democrats lost it, right? I mean, it's Trump's base now. People who used to vote Democratic are now voting for Trump. Now, maybe they'll learn the lesson, but the Democrats lost that. I know there's been a lot of navel-gazing about that. But is there an agenda? Is there a way if you're giving advice to people who are running around the country next year, I guess you will be quite a bit, what would you tell them to get back the base of the Democratic Party?
Well, first of all, you've got to meet people where they are. You've got to approach them in every place where they live. You have to be present in their lives. I sought out, for example, as a new senator, I sought out a seat on the Agriculture Committee. California hasn't had a senator on the Agriculture Committee in 30 to 35 years. And in part that's because Democrats have been senators in California for 30 to 35 years and have not asked for a seat. Now, we're the #1 agriculture producing state in the Union. And you can imagine the kind of statement it makes when we don't have representation on that committee. It conveys a message that we don't care about those parts of the state. We don't care about one of the most important industries in the state and one that puts food on our table. And so just traveling around California and meeting with farmers, showing them that I don't have horns. One of my favorite experiences was being in the far north of the state, meeting with the Farm Bureau. I could tell they were deeply skeptical. What does this big city Democrat want with the Farm Bureau? And I said, look, I'm new on the committee. I have to admit that in my old LA suburban urban House district, the only agriculture we had was of the illegal variety. So I have a lot to learn, but here's what I'm hearing about tariffs. Here's what I'm hearing about water. Here's what I'm hearing about other issues, immigration raids and their impact on immigration. But I want to hear from you. And I knew I made progress when at the end of the meeting, one of the farmers turns to me and says, I don't know why the president calls you watermelon head. You have a perfectly normal-sized head. And I took some comfort in knowing that these are people who grow melons. So they know a thing or two about a melon. But there's nothing more fun, I find, in politics than upsetting people's expectations. And so I think Democrats need to upset some expectations people have about Democrats. And by showing people respect, by hearing what they have to say, by offering things that would improve their quality of life, by focusing on what will improve their quality of life and not placing so much focus on the things that divide us.
And that takes us to the shutdown, which a lot of people, when it ended, were not happy with Democrats for caving, as they said. And my own feeling was after 43 days, with people brought to the brink of desperation and hunger by the government shutdown because Donald Trump doesn't care. He would essentially have people go hungry in order to defeat you guys. But they went through all that, right? The air traffic control, all the things that were brought to a halt. Federal employees out where I live in Frederick, Maryland, without pay. What was accomplished?
Well, I, as you probably know, was bitterly opposed to providing them the votes they needed. And I was bitterly opposed to that in March when this first came up, when there was a first government funding bill. My feeling in March was that we had already seen by March, just in the first couple months of the Trump administration, that whatever funding agreement we may reach, they were going to cheat on. They were going to impound funds and rescind funds. They would say, okay, let's reach an agreement, and once we do, we're telling you we're not going to honor it down the road. And we were already seeing all of this illegal activity, the mass firings, the extortion of institutions by the administration, and to me, giving them 6 months of running room was completely unacceptable. So I fought that in March. I fought it again now for the same reasons, except we had that much more proof. And I wanted two things out of the negotiation, neither of which we got. One was the extension of the Affordable Care Act tax credits so that millions of my constituents in California and millions more around the country wouldn't lose access to health care. But I also wanted some guarantee in that legislation that they wouldn't cheat on it. And we got neither at the end of the day. And yes, it's certainly true the president did something really, I think, unique in shutdown history, and that is sought to maximize the pain people were going through, not minimize it, but maximize it. by threatening to withhold pay once it was over, by firing people lawlessly while it was going on, by withholding food, and more. But when we began this fight for health care, I remember speaking up in caucus, and by the way, I ignored all the advice I gave myself when I got to the Senate, which was I was going to be seen and not heard, at least for a while. But with everything going on, that was just not possible. And so I made a nuisance of myself and have, speaking out on these issues. And I remember saying early in this fight, this is ultimately going to be a contest of wills. And whoever has the greatest will win this fight. And it needs to be us. And 6 weeks into this fight, the public was very much with us. We won this historic election. The president himself was acknowledging that his handling of the shutdown, or rather his mishandling of it, was hurting him. Now, it was also hurting a lot of American people. But we were weighing the temporary pain that he was inflicting on people during the shutdown with the permanent pain people would experience if they couldn't get health care. And my feeling was we need to stay at it until the president picks up the phone and calls not Schumer but Thune and says, you need to fix this. You need to end this. You need to make some deal. I don't care what the deal looks like. I didn't even know that we were taking away these tax credits. You probably would say that whether we did or not. But this is hurting me. And that's the only thing he cares about, right. Something hurting him. So I wanted us to hold out. We didn't. And at the same time, one of the things I think we did achieve is for a country that otherwise might not have known who took their health care away, the American people now understand who was fighting for their health care, who was fighting to bring down the cost of health care, who was fighting to the point of shutting down the whole government for weeks and weeks for the right to raise people's health insurance costs, who was willing to take food away from people if necessary. And so I think it's important for the American people to know that, and they did, and I think that's part of what they voted on. But now, moving forward, we have to continue the fight to provide access to health care for people, because at this moment, there are millions of people looking at their new bills and thinking, I just can't afford this. Do I just go uninsured now? And that will literally cost people their lives.
I want to pick up on the opening, it seems to me, that's right there for Democratic populism, because all of the cuts and the refusal to provide, extend the tax credits for health care are in order to pay for the giant tax cuts for the wealthiest people in the country. Do you get a sense that there's any energy in the Democratic Party for, a constitutional amendment to provide a wealth tax, right? Elizabeth Warren used to talk about a law. It may or may not withstand the Supreme Court. But there's a sense that actually ginning up the country, you could probably get 60, 70% of Americans for the filthy rich tax increase on the filthy rich amendment, or whatever you'd call it. I don't feel that kind of populist energy, except out of the Bernie wing, to say this is an opening. As I say, I think there's majorities of Americans who know that too much money for far too long has gone to far too few people, and that the money is there to help pay for what you're talking about.
I think that's exactly right. And you don't need to amend the Constitution to address this. What we saw on the big ugly bill was a massive transfer of wealth. It was taking $1 trillion out of healthcare, out of food assistance, and giving it to rich people and large corporations. To reverse that doesn't require any kind of constitutional amendment. It does require the will to do it, and frankly, to go well beyond the simple repeal of that horrible bill, but to address this unsustainable and unconscionable income inequality, wealth inequality in this country. I mean, it is astounding to me that a handful of families have the combined wealth of half the country. I mean, how is that possible? How is that necessary? How is that desirable? And the thing is, none of that is necessary. None of it is desirable. It's terrible economics. It's horribly immoral. And you can fix that by changing our tax code. And I think one of the things you're pointing to is what the American people want is not an incremental answer that says, okay, we just repeal what Trump did and go back to the status quo before. Well, the status quo before was still huge income inequality. We are not such a poor country that we can't afford health care, quality health care for everyone. We can afford that indeed. We can't afford not to have that. And you do need to hear lots of voices in our caucus making that case. In these debates we've had in caucus, I have been very much aligned with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren and Chris Murphy, and I walked out of the last debate we had in caucus with Bernie, and he was complimenting some of the points I had made in the caucus, and I said, I told you when I got to the Senate that we were going to have a lot more in common than you expect. And we do. I mean, I think he's right about the healthcare system being broken. I think he's right about the massive, unsustainable income inequality. And I'd like to hear more members of our caucus talking about that.
And I wonder if one of the lessons of the Mamdani election is daring. Just try something, propose something, get people excited about something that seems beyond the realm of the possible in, old-fashioned Washington politics.
Well, I'd say that's not only a lesson of Mamdani's campaign, but frankly, one thing you have to take away from Donald Trump and the MAGA world is if you are willing to try to move the country far and fast, you can do it. In their case, in a horribly destructive, mean-hearted way. But if you can move the country that fast in that direction, you can move it fast in a positive direction, in one that's affirming of our democracy, but that gets things done. When I ran for the Senate, I had a very simple campaign message. It was, we need to be able to get shit done in California. It's too hard to build housing here. It's too hard to build a factory here.
Is there a bumper sticker with that on?
Pretty much. Yeah. I don't know that we put in a bumper sticker, but there has been a growing frustration in Democratic states and Democratic cities. It's just too hard to get things done. And my central focus in terms of my affirmative agenda is on housing. I think we have a fundamental supply problem. There just isn't enough housing, and you can spend billions, and we are in California, to move people off the sidewalk and into housing. And if you're not investing in building a lot more housing and raising people's incomes, the people you move off the sidewalk into housing are going to be replaced by others on the street. There's just no way to solve this problem without a lot more housing. And so we need to be able to bring down the cost of building housing. We need to remove some of the obstacles to building housing. We have to bring a sense of urgency to this. I want to see the Democratic Party be the party of the next housing boom in America. In the same way we built millions of houses for returning GIs after World War II, let's do it again. To me, that's the kind of thing you can get out there. You can have a bold vision about how to accomplish it. And it's simply not beyond our capacity to do. So I would love to see more in our party articulating a bold plan to move us forward, to get things done, to get America moving, but also one that appeals to people's better angels. In the first impeachment, I had originally been approaching the case like it was an ordinary criminal prosecution. I had been a prosecutor. He was charged with serious impeachable offenses. I thought all I needed to do was prove him guilty. And then one of my staff came up to me about a couple weeks into the trial and said, they think you've proven him guilty. They need to know why he should be removed. And it was a bit of a revelation because I thought, wait a minute. Are you saying that they accept we've proven that he withheld hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid to extort Ukraine into helping him cheat in the election, and that's not enough? But it wasn't enough. And I pivoted to a different kind of argument, which I think is still the argument we also have to make the American people, which is this is a man who cannot tell the truth. Cannot tell the truth. This is someone who doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. This is someone who is fundamentally indecent. He is not who we are. He is not who we are. And I think that what Democrats need to be campaigning on in the midterms is, here is our positive agenda for the country, but also here's why it's not happening today. Because we have a corrupt president who doesn't give a rat's ass for you. His personal economy is doing great while yours suffers. And he is just not who we are and not who we want to be.
And he is precisely the man the founders warned us against, right? And that leads to the question about the midterms. How confident are you that they'll be free and fair and resolve the important questions before the country in the way we usually do? Are we going to see troops on the streets of places that he thinks will vote the other way? I mean, how concerned are you about our democracy?
Well, I am concerned. I think anyone who has watched and experienced what we've seen in the last 10 months can't help but be concerned. And we obviously have to take every precaution we can to make sure those elections are free and fair, to make sure that we have the legal strategies, that we have the voters mobilized, that we overcome all of the obstacles we know they're already trying to put in the place of people exercising their franchise. But here's the thing. Even as it's right to be concerned about it, and you would have to be, I think, naive not to have that concern, we cannot allow that concern to paralyze us, to prevent us from doing all the hard work we need to win those elections. There's nothing more that they would like than to convey that opposition to this regime is pointless. It's pointless. You might as well not even try to work on the elections. You might as well just give up now and walk away or stay away or remain silent, because none of it is going to matter. They would love for us to have that kind of paralytic despair. And we have to simply refuse. Simply refuse. And be inspired by people, and there are millions of people and millions of folks to be inspired by who are standing up right now. I mean, I take inspiration from the prosecutors at DOJ, like the one in New York who refused to dismiss the corruption case against the mayor, Eric Adams, because the mayor was now useful to the president in an unrelated policy matter. I was a prosecutor for almost 6 years. I'm still shocked by that. We've never seen anything like that. And this prosecutor wrote to the Justice Department in refusing to dismiss the case, saying, I'm sure you can find some coward or some fool to do this, but it was never going to be me. I'm inspired by that. I'm inspired by the director of the CDC, who quit or was fired because she wasn't going to rubber stamp some decisions of conspiracy theorists appointed to the Vaccination Commission if it meant jeopardizing healthy American people. And there are countless examples of that. Let's look to those heroic stories to be inspired ourselves. They want to pick us apart. They want to go after this university but not that one, in the hope that if you're not the university that's in the focus right now, maybe you keep your head down, or maybe you just go along. They hope that of the American people. They hope that of every aspect of our society, and the only answer to that must be collective action to stand up to this president. It has to be an attitude of defiance. Of defiance. We love this country too much to give in to this horribly ugly president of ours.
let me shift gears a little bit before we go to the audience questions in about 10 minutes or so. And on a foreign policy issue, what is happening in the Caribbean and Venezuela? I don't have any inside information, you probably do, but it feels to me like the end game might be regime change, that the opposition party in Venezuela is saying very nice things to Trump. We've moved this aircraft carrier, we're blowing boats out of the water. It seems it's all adding up to a story that we have heard again and again in our history, and it never ends well. Am I exaggerating what might be happening? What is your read? What is your understanding of what's happening?
You're not exaggerating at all, and it's not just the end game. I think it was the beginning game, the middle game, and the end game. Do we really believe that you're going to move the largest warship in the world, the USS Gerald Ford, and about 10,000 service members to the region with a armada of other ships and capabilities to go after a few speedboats? Really? Does anyone think that is credible? Now, the fact that all those forces have been moved to the region doesn't mean we're going to invade Venezuela. But what I think it does mean is this is all about regime change. And by marshaling all those forces to the region, the president is now in the position of either using those forces to topple Maduro or retreating all those forces and losing face. So that is not the position our country should be in. What's more, these attacks on the shipping, these attacks on these speedboats are just plainly unlawful, unconstitutional killing of civilians. And yeah, they may be criminals too, but they're not enemy combatants. They're not imminently attacking the United States. There is no legal basis to be blowing them out of the water. And if the legal basis they give, and I've read the OLC opinion, is accepted, then there is no restraint on the use of force anywhere in the world with practically any pretext you want to come up with. So we're at a very dangerous moment in terms of our foreign policy as well. I've offered now 2 resolutions with Tim Kaine and also with Rand Paul to try to put an end to this. Under the War Powers Act, you can offer privileged resolutions, which mean they have to be taken up for vote. We have won 2 Republican votes. We need 4. We may get those 4, but it would be a terrible tragedy if we have to wait until we're at war with Venezuela to get Congress to finally do its job. We have already ceded our most important power, and that is the power of the purse. And now we are ceding our war power as well. The Senate might as well just go home, like the House did for 2 months. We might as well just go home because we are viewed as an appendage, an unnecessary appendage by the White House. And because of a lack of courage of Senate Republicans, we are very much acting like an unnecessary constitutional afterthought.
And that raises a question about our Constitution. It doesn't work, right? I mean, this is a lawless administration in so many fundamental ways, putting troops on the streets of our cities in order to supposedly fight crime, which isn't even a federal responsibility in that sense, in defiance of our laws, shuttering departments, refusing to spend money. The litany of open lawlessness by the President of the United States, it's not even that big an issue in the public mind, it seems to me, and certainly nothing is done about it. We have, it feels to me, obviously he's a wannabe authoritarian, and increasingly the wannabe is turning into an is, and nothing's stopping him. What do you say to people who say, well, what's the point then of having a constitution if it's unenforceable against a man like this?
Well, the thing is, there's nothing wrong with our Constitution. To paraphrase Shakespeare, the flaw is not in our Constitution, but in ourselves. You can have the best written Constitution in the world, and I believe we do. You can have the best written laws meant to constrain the worst abuses of human nature, and maybe we do. But none of that will be enough if people don't give meaning to their oath of office. If they're not willing to accept the truth, or even that there is something called fact, none of it is enough. And one of the lessons that keeps coming home to me throughout this whole Trump period is something the historian Robert Caro once said in an interview, when he said that power doesn't corrupt as much as it reveals. It doesn't always reveal us for our best, but it says a lot about who we are. And power has revealed a lot about my colleagues in Congress. I would have thought before this decade that if we ever had a president so corrupt and so willing to trample on our Constitution, there would be at least 100 Liz Cheneys and Adam Kinzingers in the House and Senate standing up to him. And as it turned out, there were just 2. And they're both no longer in the Congress. Before all this, there were a great many of my colleagues who I respected and even admired, because even though our views were very different, I believed that they believed what they were saying. I have a hard time believing that many of them believe what they're saying today. I listen in the Judiciary Committee to a lot of my colleagues across the aisle rail with just the most righteous indignation about the horrible weaponization of the Justice Department under that well-known partisan Merrick Garland. And it is so fanciful as to be absurd, but they speak it with what appears to be total conviction. And I don't know, maybe they're better actors than they used to be, or maybe they've so internalized the talking points that they persuaded themselves, or maybe it's the kind of rationalization which I've heard over the years, which goes like this: if I didn't vote to confirm Hegseth, I would be replaced by someone you would really hate. If I didn't vote to confirm RFK, I would lose my primary, and just imagine what you'd get. And the list goes on and on and on. And my view is, I'm not sure it could get so much worse. I mean, if you're going to keep voting for what he's doing, then how much worse can it be? But one of the things that I just don't understand, I mean, I understand the kind of very near-term political dynamic. They're terrified of a primary challenge. They're afraid, some of them, for their own personal safety. But at the same time, I just don't understand, what do they plan to tell their kids and grandkids one day? What did you do, they will ask, when that horrible man was running the country? Please tell me you didn't go along with these masked agents tackling people in the street. I met with a group of Latinos in California was it yesterday, the day before? I can't keep my day straight. And they were telling me how they now feel they have to walk around with their identification papers. What country is this? Where people now, citizens, have to walk around with their passport because they're afraid that they will be arrested or tackled to the ground or detained for days without counsel based on how they look. And I just don't know what my colleagues are going to do to explain how and why they empowered someone like this. Now, I have every confidence that we're going to get through this.
That was what I was going to ask. There's a disheartening conversation, a disheartening subject. People get really depressed when they talk about it. So do you find hope? How do you find hope?
I'm convinced that we will get through this. I think when you're in crisis, and our country is in crisis, it's often hard to see when it ends, and sometimes it's even hard to see if it will end. But it does end. This too shall pass. We will look back on this period with astonishment and ask ourselves, how in the hell did that guy ever become president of the United States twice? That day will come. That day will come. The challenge for all of us, and the way that I conceptualize this, is we need to try to decide every single day, what can I do today to mitigate the harms? So that when we get through this, there is less we need to fix. What can I do to mitigate the harms? And what I would suggest to folks is don't try to do everything. Don't try to take on all the problems of the country or the world. That is just the road to despair. But find one thing, find something that you can do. In Chicago, where they learned from our experience in Los Angeles, people are driving other people's kids to school so their parents don't have to risk deportation. They're dropping off food at people's houses so they don't have to risk shopping and being stopped in the street. And it's not just immigration either. It's, as I say, courageous federal employees and courageous citizens and university leaders and others. It's law firms taking on unpopular clients. So find something, some way to help. There are lots of great organizations. You don't have to invent the wheel yourself that you can plug yourselves into and amplify their efforts. But we will get through this. We will get through this. We're a deeply resilient country. People who bet against this country have always lost that bet. But we have a real responsibility right now, every day, to figure out what we can do to mitigate the harms.
And we're going to go to questions about that sense of solidarity, right? That sense of being able to pitch in together, shoulder to shoulder. I was in Chicago, did a report on what's going on there, and neighborhood after neighborhood, exactly what you said. The moms of Rogers Park on the street corners at street dismissal, looking up and down, making sure that if ICE comes, the kids or the parents who are there picking them up are safe. And you could feel their spirits lifted by exactly what you're talking about. Put your shoulder to the wheel, and it feels better. All right, so now it's your turn.
Good afternoon. My name is Alejandro Serrano. I'm a journalist with the Texas Tribune. Our first question comes from Mohammed from Austin. Senator, do Democrats need new leadership in the Senate?
We need to find a way to maintain unity in the Senate among ourselves and with the House. This was an argument I made in March. It was an argument I've repeated in the latest shutdown fight. And that is, we're in the minority in both houses. We're obviously locked out of the White House, and the Supreme Court is now essentially a far-right institution. The only way we can effectively push back is if we have unity. And we have not had that. Now, we had it for 40 days and 40 nights, sounds like Moses. But we have to find a way to maintain that unity. I'm new to the Senate. One of the things I'm discovering in the Senate is that in the Senate, everyone's a king. And I don't mean in the kind of Donald Trump dictatorial manner. I mean, everybody feels like a free agent. Some were governors, others were captains of industry, some of us were House members. But it is a very different dynamic than in the House. I also, had the benefit in the House of serving under the singular leadership of the most capable speaker in American history, Nancy Pelosi. And it's simply not fair to compare anyone to Nancy Pelosi. She was a generational talent, is a generational talent. Nevertheless, we have to find a way to be united and stay united. We can't have a situation where a small number of our members make a decision that binds the entire caucus and the whole country. And so we're going to have a heart-to-heart about how do we do this.
That sounds like a yes.
I have great respect for Leader Schumer, and I'm glad that he voted against this bad deal. But it's going to require more than any one of our members, including our leader. We're going to have to make the decision that we have not made as a caucus, that we're going to stay together. And so we're going to have to, I think, have a real heart-to-heart about how we do that.
This next one comes from Denise from Austin. What are the safeguards in place to ensure Trump does not have a third term? Will the Constitution prevail?
The short answer is we have to and are doing everything we possibly can to both anticipate what they're going to do, to counter what they're going to do, to counter what they're already doing. The most effective tool that we've had, and it is effective to a point, has been litigation. We have been suing and we have been winning on a whole host of issues. Now, what the Supreme Court has been doing, primarily through its shadow docket, is it has essentially been deciding, even when the harms are plain and plainly unconstitutional, such as these indiscriminate immigration raids, the Supreme Court has, to its, I think, endless shame, decided it will let the harms continue for the year or years while cases are litigated. Now, that's not the case in every litigation, but it is the case all too often. And I think Robert Caro's point about what power reveals has revealed a lot about John Roberts, who many had hoped would be a moderating influence on the court, but who has decided, most particularly with that horrendous immunity decision, but also with the Dobbs decision, he's decided that it's more important for him to be near the center of power on the court than to maintain the constitutional requirements of our democratic society.
Do you draw anything from Amy Coney Barrett, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, when asked directly about a third term? She said, well, that's what the amendment says. Wouldn't say, the Constitution forbids it. Said, well, the words of the amendment say that.
Yeah.
Sounds like weaseling.
I don't know how much confidence to draw from anything I've seen in her comments, opinions. That phraseology reminds me a bit of what every Trump nominee has said when we have asked, did Joe Biden win the 2020 election? And the answer is, he was certified the winner. So a lot of these are very artful dodges and some not so artful dodges. But the short answer, or shorter answer, is we have to continue to do everything possible through the courts, through volunteerism, through poll watching. We have to hope and pray that our military understands their legal obligations. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that they began by firing all the lawyers at the top of the military. They've taken this very dictatorial view that anything the president says or his representative at the Pentagon says is the law. But nevertheless, we have a very strong culture in our military that is not present in a lot of other countries that have lost their democracies, of the military remaining loyal to the Constitution and civilian authority, which I believe will hold. But obviously we need to continue to do everything to reduce the risks. But I continue to think the biggest risk of all is accepting the idea that we can't possibly have a free and fair election, and so why bother participate? We have to all participate. We have to make sure all our friends and neighbors participate. We have to make sure that in these midterms and the presidential election that follows, that we have the most massive outpouring of voter participation we've ever seen, because nothing less may be necessary to save our democracy.
This next one's from Sharon from Georgetown. When Democrats control Congress, what are the next steps for judicial reform for the U.S. Supreme Court?
Well, I think there are three reforms of the Supreme Court. One, which I think is probably the most consequential, is to put a term limit on the Supreme Court. And I think another is to adopt an enforceable code of ethics on the court. And finally is to change the size of the court so that we are not forced to suffer an entire generation of this reactionary opinion on the court. But here's the rub. I think it's certainly constitutional to impose term limits on the court. If you do it by means of, for example, let's say you decided 18 years was the appropriate amount of time, that after the expiration of 18 years, that justice would rotate back onto the Court of Appeals or onto the district court, so they would have lifetime on the court, but they would not have lifetime on a particular court. Now, I think that's constitutional because at the time the Constitution was established, we didn't have the courts delineated, and so I don't think there was any constitutional obstacle. But here's the rub.
That's very clever.
Well, here's the rub. It would be this Supreme Court to decide
That's true.
whether a limit on them was constitutional. And likewise, we might adopt an enforceable code of ethics, but the rub comes when you try to enforce it. Is this court going to allow us to enforce a code of ethics? Is Thomas going to support that, or Alito, or a majority of this court going to support that? Which gets to the final remedy of changing the composition of the court, and that may need to be the first step to make the other two possible. I do think that the most significant, if I had to pick one, would be to put term limits on the court, because it would end the kind of institution-destroying gamesmanship we saw with Mitch McConnell. But those are three reforms that I think are necessary and important to restore some public confidence in an institution which is just badly broken.
This next one's about the executive branch. Should the next Democratic president utilize the expanding authority of the executive spearheaded by Trump, or lead more with input from Congress? Came from Frank in Austin.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
Yes. Should the next Democratic president utilize the expanding authority of the executive branch spearheaded by Trump, or lead more with input from Congress?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the lesson we should take is the one that we discussed earlier, which is we should use the power of the Congress and the presidency to move this country swiftly in a progressive direction of providing universal health care, of addressing income inequality in this country, of making sure that we can answer a central question that's at the heart of our economy and, I believe, at the heart of our democracy, and that is, if you're working hard in America, can you still earn a good living for yourself and your family? We have to use all the powers of the government to make sure that the answer to that question is, once again, yes, a resounding yes. I would not favor having a Democratic president break the law the way Donald Trump is. I wouldn't favor him engaging in mass layoffs of people in violation of law, or illegally impounding funds, or illegally rescinding funds, or engaging in indiscriminate immigration raids, or any of that stuff. But I would favor the president using the limits of his power in the service of our democracy and to move the country forward. And having the Congress do the same thing.
Does it feel? It feels to me like Congress hasn't worked properly in a long, long time. We have national problems that we need the national legislature to solve. Immigration, one of the chief, income inequality. Does it feel from the inside like the days that this questioner is talking about, that Congress could be an equal partner, as it should be, that really we're a presidential country now, whatever our Constitution says?
Well, that's really up to us. It's up to voters to decide, is that the kind of Congress you want to see, that is essentially a lapdog for the president, a lapdog for a president of either party. And it's in the hands of voters to decide, are we going to vote for people like that, or are we going to vote them out? We have all the power we need to change that, to insist on a Congress that is reflective of the views and desires of the American people when it comes to expanding access to health care and Medicare for all, when it comes to a Congress that is either diligent or supine. Only the voters can make that decision. I will say this. The question gets to a broader challenge in America, which we haven't discussed yet, which I think is one of the most difficult cross-cutting challenges we face, and that is Americans simply don't get their information from the same place anymore. We get it in large part from algorithms that are set to anger and provoke us, to divide us, to plague us with fear. We haven't figured out how to deal with this new information environment. And I think that solving that problem is also going to be necessary to having a Congress that's functional, where you have people who are willing to work with each other, even eager to work with each other to move the country forward, who don't simply look at every legislative issue through the prism of, will this help us win or lose? I keep coming back to one of the Republicans when Obama was first president who, in the context of the Affordable Care Act, I believe it was the Affordable Care Act, said that they wanted to make this Obama's Waterloo, that if they could make him unsuccessful, they could reclaim the White House. That attitude that if you can make a president or a party unsuccessful, no matter what damage it might do to the country, because it's good politics, we have to get past that ruinous idea. But that will require us, I think, to figure out now, how do we deal with this information environment when it's increasingly difficult to even talk to our neighbor, sometimes increasingly difficult to even talk to our family. I remember rushing home to my dormitory in college to watch Walter Cronkite's last broadcast. And that was a time when there was a large body of agreed upon fact. We might differ with what to do with those facts, but at least we agreed there was something called fact. And now we live in an environment where people tune into the news they want to hear, or the algorithms make it even easier to show you what you want to see. And we're going to have to figure this out. To me, the disruption of our information environment is just as acute as the invention of the printing press. And it took us centuries to get used to that and a few wars. We've had to get used to this innovation in a relative millisecond, but we have to figure this out. We have to figure out a way to stop viewing each other as our enemy. And that solution will come when we figure out how to be better consumers of information again, how to determine what's true and what's not true, how to stop rewarding advertising behemoths for dividing us the way they do.
One thing as we wrap up that I've heard throughout this conversation is your idealism, which is a hard quality to come by today in a cynical age. And I think that's part of the fuel that we all need in our own hearts, in our own civic hearts. And so hearing you speak about these things so thoughtfully, but also so from that place of idealism, has been great for me, and I hope for you. Thank you, Adam.
Well, thank you. I think thank you. Thank you, everyone.